Welcome, dear friends, to the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center Sunday morning program. Please note this program is being recorded and will be made available on the Nova Baha'i Center website. I want to take a moment to thank the Sunday morning program team. We will now begin with our devotional program.
Praised and glorified art thou, O God. Grant that the day of attaining thy holy presence may be fast approaching. Cheer our hearts through the potency of thy love and good pleasure, and bestow upon us steadfastness, that we may willingly submit to thy will and thy decree. Verily, thy knowledge embraceth all things thou hast created or wilt create, and thy celestial might transcendeth whatsoever thou hast called or wilt call into being. There is none to be worshipped but thee. There is none to be desired except thee. There is none to be adored besides thee. There is naught to be loved save thy good pleasure. Verily, thou art the supreme ruler, the sovereign truth, the help in peril, the self-subsisting.
Oh, friend, oh, friend, in the garden of thy heart, plant not but the rose of love, plant not but the rose of love, the rose of love. And from the nightingale of affection and desire, loosen not thy hold, loosen not thy hold, loosen not thy hold. Treasure the companionship of the righteous, and eschew all fellowship with the ungodly. Oh, friend, in the garden of thy heart, plant not but the rose of love, plant not but the rose of love. Plant not but the rose of love. Treasure the companionship of the righteous, and eschew all fellowship with the ungodly.
Good morning, dear friends, and welcome again to the Sunday morning program. We are always so happy to be with all of you and look forward to seeing you each week. Today's speaker has been a member of the Baha'i faith since she was 19 years old. She served in many different capacities, including home front and international pioneering. She has a Master of Science degree in nursing and in international public health. She's currently partially retired and works part-time as a psychiatric nurse practitioner. Her name is Miss Sue Ballew St. Clair. Sue is focused on addressing the most vital and challenging issue in this country and the importance of centering the roles of people of African descent, the people we refer to as the people of the eye, in the work of the faith. I would like to welcome Ms. Ballew St. Clair to our program. Sue, it's such a pleasure to have you with us and to have the opportunity to learn from you. Please let me know when to start the PowerPoint.
Okay, I will. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I think this is the second time that I have been blessed with the opportunity to be able to share with you my thoughts about a very important issue that, as Baha'is in the United States, we are needing to focus on. Before starting the PowerPoint, I just want to say this. Everything that I'm doing around racial justice is my understanding as I'm studying the guidance. And I just want to let everyone know that I'm not speaking from a position of I've got all the answers, and I just want you to take it in and do what I say. I'm just sharing with you my thoughts. This particular presentation is mainly about the effect of racism on our white brothers and sisters in the United States. We spend a lot of time, and I think that we should, regarding the effect of racism on people who are of African descent since the time of slavery. But we also need to spend some time on how it's affecting white people so that they understand that they also have something that they've got to work on within their own hearts to help to alleviate the issue of racism. Something that they didn't create, but that is a part of who they are and who they benefit from because of the type of society that we live in. So let's start the presentation. So the reason why I started out like this, racism, a distortion of the human spirit, because this is what the House of Justice is telling us. And I found this graphic, and I just felt like it was a wonderful graphic of what is happening in the United States for Blacks and whites. And so let's go on. Before, the whole idea of white supremacy was something that did not exist until the creation of, well, I take that back. It started in Europe, and it became an issue back in the 17th century, but it became really a powerful focus after people from Europe started moving to the United States and buying into slavery. So before the 17th century, people did not think of themselves as belonging to something called the white race. They were aware of color, but it was no different than being aware of having brown hair or blonde hair or black hair, or it just had no meaning until much later in the United States, the 17th century. But once the idea was invented, it quickly began to reshape the modern world. The invention of a white racial identity was motivated from the start by a need to justify the enslavement of Africans. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was a consequence of slavery. So white supremacy is defined as both the belief that the white race is inherently superior to other races and that white people should have control over people of other races. It's important to know that the concept of white supremacy was created by those whites who were in power, who had both monetary and political power and owned land and had position in society. And this was created so that they could keep the mass of white people in a certain position as it related to people of color and Black people. To let them know that, well, at least you're white. So, and here are the privileges that you have that others don't or won't. Let's go on. So the term white was racialized as a classification of people and a skin color specifier as I stated earlier, in Europe. The concept of whiteness has particular resonance in the Northern European countries, in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, and South Africa. Go on. White people in North America, they live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. So what does this social environment look like that allows them to be so well insulated? It's an environment in which they are required, they are chosen as a single, say it differently. Many white people have the single required multicultural education in college and on their jobs that gives them a certain sense of what cultural competency should look like, but it doesn't help them to understand where they are and where they need to go. And so the whole insulated portion of that has to do with being completely separate in the way in which they think, live, and behave from others around them. And so they have no idea and no sense of what others are going through. Consequently, when there are surveys done of whites versus Blacks about racism or anything related to racial differences, there's a huge gap between what white people say and what Black people say. And I think all of us know about that. Let's go on. Because there is such an insular way of living their lives that includes privilege and that includes a form of ability to do whatever they want within the context of a society that allows for them to grow and develop and become. They are, but at the same time, they have these programs that in school and on their jobs are telling them that here's all you need to do to be relevant as a person who is dealing with racism. So when they are approached with something that tells them that, well, you're not thinking about it the way that it really is. The reality is different from the reality that you're perceiving. A lot of stress develops, and it's called cognitive dissonance, and we'll get to that in a moment. But this stress plays out in the ways that I have listed here. If a white person it's suggested to them that their viewpoint comes from a racialized frame of reference, they see this as a challenge to their ability to be objective. If they are seen, a person of color talks directly about their racial perspectives, that causes stress because it's a challenge to the white racial codes. And some of those codes are, if we back up the slide just a moment, some of those codes have to do with urban versus inner city, disadvantaged versus white, overadvantaged, privileged. So there's more codes, but that just gives you an example. And this racially coded language, reproduces racist images and perspectives, while at the same time, it reproduces the comfortable illusion that race and its problems are what they have, meaning blacks, not us, meaning whites. Go on. So back to the stress. So people of color choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people in situations having to do with race causes them to feel that the challenge to white racial expectations and their need and entitlement to racial comfort is there's a challenge to that. I'll give you an example. When there is a mixed group of white and black, and we're talking about something that, because blacks are conditioned from slavery to protect the feelings of whites. And so they automatically, not everyone, but this is a tendency, automatically jump in to say something that soothes what they perceive may be feelings of white people that they may be feeling harmed, and they want to make that feel better. And on the other side, it's an expectation from whites that this will happen to protect them. People of color not being willing to tell their stories or answer questions about their racial experiences, this is considered a challenge to the colonialist ways of developing society that began in other countries but was brought to America. So America is really a colonized way of developing society, where, of course, whites are on top, especially white men, and others are in the hierarchy, lesser and lesser and lesser of importance, down to black women. So the highest one of the hierarchy are white men, the lowest are black women. And these are studies that have been done and have been proven to play out. Next one has to do with a fellow white not providing agreement with one's interpretations. So this would be a challenge to white solidarity. In other words, we all have to stay in the game together. And if we don't, then, and it gets broken apart by one white person agreeing with someone black that's saying something, hey, what's the matter with you? And then there are ways in which they are then shut out from the society that is meant for them to move and live in. The last one on this slide is receiving feedback that one's behavior had a racist impact. And this then is a challenge to white liberalism. Go on. Going on, and I'll go through these very quickly. There's a challenge to individualism. There's a challenge to meritocracy. And that means a system, an organization, or a society in which individuals are chosen and moved into positions of success, power, and influence. And of course, we know they're chosen based upon color, based upon name, based upon the school you went to, based upon who you know. All of those factors play into how you are chosen to be, to move up into positions of power. Challenge to white authority, challenge to white centrality, and whites have not had to build the cognitive or affective skills or develop the stamina that would allow for constructive engagement across racial divides. And if you have questions, we can certainly talk about this when we have questions. Go on. So if and when an educational program directly addresses racism and the privileges of whites, the common white response includes anger, withdrawal, emotional incapacitation, guilt, argument, and cognitive dissonance. So all of these happens because there's cognitive dissonance. And the cognitive dissonance simply means that there's an inconsistent thought, belief, or attitude that's being presented to what they believe or what they understand. And it can happen internally, or it can happen as a result of the conversations that they're having with others. So this causes different responses in order to normalize the mindset again. So-called progressive whites, and I say that because not everyone that says they're progressive are, because otherwise they wouldn't get angry or upset when things are presented to them that show what society is really made of. They may still insulate themselves via claims that they are beyond the need for engaging with the content of programs that talk about what needs to be done, because they already had a class on this or already know this, or I've read all the books, or I've seen the movies. So these are the kinds of things that serve as a protection against being perceived as having racist ideas. Move on. So I wanted to go through that part real quickly, and there's a lot more there. That was just meant to give an overview, a quick overview of some of what happens in America as it relates to the white section of our country. And again, this does not apply to everyone. It's a tendency. It's a probability just because of being born and raised in this country and being exposed to media, to programs on TV, to books, to school, teachers. Everything helps to infect and then reinforce that infection. Now, the House of Justice says that racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. And when I read that, I talk about cognitive dissonance, it immediately caught me up. It was like, wait a minute. Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality? Well, then what does that say about our country? Because our country was not built. It was built on racism. So that means we have no idea what true morality looks like. None. It's something that we're going to have to figure out based upon the information that we're getting from our faith, from Baha'u'llah, the Baha'i, the Effendi, the Universal House of Justice. That's the only way we're going to understand that standard of true morality. We certainly can't find it within society. They go on to say it deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life. So the House of Justice now is telling the white people, or those who are oppressing in our country, it's white people, or I'll put it this way, it's white supremacy, because I want to make a clear distinction between people who are white and that whole white supremacy consciousness. They're telling us that it stifles and stunts the spiritual growth of individuals who think this way, while at the same time blighting the progress of the rest of humanity, of humankind. So this requires, to my mind, a lot of reflection, a lot of consultation and conversation about what they're talking about and what that looks like, and then what can we do about it to make a difference. Go on. There's something called the Manichean psychology. And in this psychology, Hussein Bulhan, the Manichean psychology permeates the prevailing values and beliefs. The oppressor identifies himself in terms of the sublime and beautiful, while depicting the oppressed in terms of absolute evil and ugliness. So the challenge to someone who is among the oppressors of society, you fall into that category, even if you are not perceived as someone that is doing it, there's the category. So someone who is of that category, and they look to see what is beautiful, are they going to look to people who are women, for example, who have a certain facial makeup, have a certain body proportion, and are they going to compare that when they see someone who, this is just looking at it very physically, someone who is Black that has a different body proportion, that has a different facial makeup, and are they going to deny that as having anything to do with beauty? And only it's this perception of beauty that is perceived as what is white. And we know that too often when someone is Black, they're perceived as being ape-like. And this happens much too often. And it comes out at times when you least expect it to happen. So that's just that. It also has to do with intelligence, level of intelligence, ability to live a meaningful and comfortable life and make a certain income, to have a certain position. Who can best do that? All of those things are determined based upon the view of the oppressor about others who function within that realm versus those who are oppressed. This creates a worldview where the group doing the oppressing, in America this means white people, is always the example of everything positive. It is aligned with the white racial frame and teaching us that whites and everything related to whites is superior. There is an old adage in the Black community that we would prefer to buy our ice from the white man because his ice is colder than that purchased from the Black man. Again, it permeates all of us. Go on. So what happens in this is what Manichean psychology is telling us. What happens in the person who is oppressed, they internalize what is being, they internalize the way in which they are perceived and perceive themselves the same way. So the well-known inferiority complex of the oppressed originates in this process. Because of this internalization, there's a lot of repressed rage, and this is acted out on each other within the oppressed community. They become auto-oppressors as they engage in self-destructive behavior that's injurious to themselves, their loved ones, and their neighbors. And we see that also played out in our society. Go on. So this is a Black journalist, and he wrote this article in Milwaukee Independent. And I just have this brief paragraph as it relates to what he wrote. It is a daily struggle to fit in. It is a constant balancing act to fit the white middle class values thrust upon people of color. It requires developing the skills known as code switching, where people of color switch back and forth from being whom they are to being who whites accept them as. And so Hussein Bulhan goes on to tell us this: the school, the history books, the comic strips, the theater halls, all these enforce cognitive dissonance and even self-hate. The closer the schoolboy, this is referring to Blacks now, and people of color, the closer the schoolboy gets to the social circle of the oppressor, the more he learns to disparage what he is by birth and race. On the one hand, he is assimilated into the dominant culture, and on the other, he is made to break away from his own culture. As he moves through various stages of education, he progressively reduces his contact with his relatives and indigenous culture. He increasingly enters the social orbit of the oppressors. Then comes the stage when he must choose either his own group or those of the oppressors. Acceptance of one entails rejection of the other. Go on. So this is just, I don't know how many of you know who Richard Thomas is. He's a professor or a professor emeritus now, Michigan State University, and has done a lot of work in this area. Here's what he says. Racism has wounded generations of non-whites far more deeply than whites will ever know. Many whites, however, still partake of the privileges of color bequeathed to them by the legacy of historic racism. Unable or unwilling to divest themselves of the advantages of being white in a world that still touts white cultural values and allocates rewards for accepting such values. As a result, racial fear and hatred still dominate interracial interactions in most multiracial societies. Next. So there is a fact. White men consider themselves superior to what black men. Now remember, I'm saying this as a generality. Another fact. Black men want to prove to white men at all costs the richness of their thought, the equal value of their intellect. To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. And they're just giving an example of, and this is written at a time when Negro was the way in which to identify people who were black or of African descent. The Antilles Negro who wants to be white will be whiter as he gains greater mastery of the cultural tool that language is. The fact of having to speak nothing but the other's language when the other was the conqueror, ruler, and oppressor was at once an affirmation of him, the oppressor, his worldview and his values, a concession to his framework, an estrangement from one's own history, values, and outlook. Next. So now we come to the ways in which they are harmed, that they don't even realize. And this is recent studies that have come out. And I'd like to let you know about a book that's called Dying of Whiteness. It was written by a white professor at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. And he did a lot of interviews with white people, both urban and rural, in Kentucky and Tennessee. And he wrote the book based upon his findings. And it supports what I'm getting ready to share you here. What is less commonly known and understood is how a system based on white supremacy harms not only Blacks and people of color, but also white people. Government programs help all people. The group that benefits the most from affirmative action programs are actually white women. The irony of this is that white women, according to reports, are actually some of the staunchest opponents of affirmative action programs. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that white people are the largest beneficiaries when it comes to government assistance programs. The Affordable Care Act, which was dubbed Obamacare, was staunchly opposed by many white Americans. According to one report, when analyzing those who gained health insurance coverage from 2010 to 2015, 8.2 million of the people who gained coverage were non-Hispanic whites. 43%. 15% were non-Hispanic Blacks, and 6.2% were Hispanics, or what we like to say, the correct way is Latinos now. Go on. So based on research, there are 5 main areas that have been identified in which white people experience the cost of racism: psychological, social, moral and spiritual, intellectual, and material and physical. So psychological involves a loss of mental health and an authentic sense of self, a socialization into a world of white supremacy that presumes that white people are superior to people of color and deserve the better positions in society, an internalization of the dominant cultural messages consciously and unconsciously, and an expected way to act that supports the current racist system. So interrupting people of color, thinking we are smarter, engaging in savior behavior, those are just a couple of the examples of how that plays out in the way in which they interact with people of color. They're denied accurate self-knowledge, white people are, denied accurate self-knowledge, and develop a distorted view of self. We often need to deny, this is referring, because he's white, she's white, I'm sorry. So she says, we often need to deny our emotions and empathy to exist in a racist society. These factors all limit the development of a healthy sense of self. And, you know, I'm saying white, but also anyone who is white passing. We have to include Persians that come over and identify with the white way of living. And so they believe then what they're told about avoiding Black people or people of color. And so they take on the same characteristics as white people in the country. Go on. The social cost is the loss and the diminishment of relationships. And what does that mean? Let's look at the next statement. Due to the structures of racism, a great deal of physical distance exists between whites and people of color. Segregation in housing and schools, job stratification. There is often limited opportunity to organically develop meaningful relationships across race. The question would be, are you living in an area where there are also Blacks and people of color? Or is the area that you are living in all white? Even cross-racial contact does not always eliminate the barriers to deeper and more authentic relationships. This is due to distrust, discomfort, biases, or cultural differences. Whites can experience disconnection from their own friends and families if they act outside the accepted norms. Remember that term, white solidarity? This is how you have to act. This is how you have to think. This is how you have to behave in order to continue to be a member of our community, the white community. So they experience a disconnection when they act differently from that, such as dating or marrying a person of color, challenging racial stereotypes and jokes, or advocating for racial justice. Next. The moral and spiritual costs are such that there's a loss of ethical and spiritual integrity. White people commonly feel some guilt or shame for being white, for being part of a legacy that has oppressed people of color and indigenous people, for intentionally or unintentionally benefiting from and perpetuating racism, and for not doing enough to dismantle it. Whites sometimes face moral ambivalence of wanting to do the right thing, but facing social pressures and realities. Faced with these ethical challenges, the awareness of racial injustice and disconnection from other human beings, white people may experience spiritual emptiness and pain. Next. I'm going to mention something here. My eldest son lives in California, and he's a financial advisor and financial planner. The majority of his clients are white Republicans who are millionaires and billionaires. And one of the things he said to me once, he said, Mom, when I handle people's money, I love them. And so therefore I love, out of that love, I want to do the best I can. And they are so hungry for it that the smallest to my home now, even though they follow Trump, and this is just saying what the reality is. They come into my home. They listen to what I have to say because I love them, and that relates back to. Oops, hello.
Hello, I'm sorry, you, for me at least, you seem to be getting cut off in that sentence. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah.
It was cut off for me too.
Okay.
Yeah, can't hear on my side.
Sue, it might be your internet.
It tells me that my internet is unstable.
Yeah.
Try and reconnect. Turn off the Wi-Fi and then put it back on the actual link.
Say that again, please.
Dovey, could you repeat that?
Hello?
Okay. You see when you went to connect the actual connection, when you click the link, it asks you to audio or Wi-Fi in. Like, do that situation again. So log out of the actual link and then come back into it and it should be fine.
You're telling her to log out of, to leave the meeting and come back?
Yeah.
Okay. Sue, is that okay? Can you leave?
Yeah,
Try
Yes,
leaving.
she's left. She's left, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
No, you're okay.
Dear friends, I hope you're noting down any of your questions and comments so that you can ask them at the end of this presentation.
I'm not sure if it's my internet or if it's I know my internet says.
Yeah, you're getting cut off again. Sue,
Okay.
I'm
Can
sorry
you
to
hear
cut
me
you.
okay?
Yes, but you seem to be getting cut off. I recommend just disabling your video temporarily so that it doesn't take up so much of your internet. Are you speaking?
No, I think she's frozen again.
Thank you everyone for your patience.
I'm sorry, this is something that I can't do anything about.
It's okay. Usually when there is someone else using our internet in our home or we have a few devices using the Wi-Fi.
It still says my internet is unstable.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Let's keep going forward.
Okay, and it does help to turn off your video camera.
Go on.
One more?
So for the intellectual, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I don't know why I'm spotlighted, so I'm gonna take myself off.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh boy.
We can hear you.
Oh, I think she, all right. So Davi, could it be that if everyone's video is off, it helps her, or it's just because it's based on her home with her Wi-Fi? Yeah, all of our videos off. Ismail, would you be able to call her in and put her on speaker?
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
There should be an option if you hit the microphone to switch to phone audio. Just as an option for her.
Ah, that's very smart. Thank you. I don't see her. So when she comes back, we'll let her know. Sue? Oh,
No, she's not here yet, Farna's.
okay. I've lost everyone. So I'm gonna.
No, we can't hear you, dear Sue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm looking at my, so we should be intellectual. I think you have to go back a bit, or maybe forward. No, back, you have to go back. Okay, intellectual. Okay, so as far as harm for people who are racist, let's see if I can make this different. The intellectual harm has to do with whites losing the opportunity to develop a full range of knowledge about self and others and the world. And you know, one of the things that has to do with this is the insular nature of America itself. Unless you move outside of the country and live outside of the country for a few months at least. Oh, I was telling you about my son's experience. Okay, I'll get back to that. You don't realize how insular we are and how much everything that we hear is being, what is the word? Is being, I can't think of the right word that I want for that, but we are not getting the full story of what's going on in the world while we're living in America. In schools and mainstream society, we generally receive distorted, biased, and limited views of the cultures, experiences, and histories of peoples of color and indigenous people. And due to the pressure to assimilate into mainstream America, culture and whiteness, many white people have also lost the knowledge of and connection to their particular European ethnic ancestry. They are taught myths about meritocracy and equal opportunity that belie the realities of institutional and systemic racism and fuel ignorance. These are powerful things that are being said about how people are controlled in our country. Go on. So before I get into this, I will go back to the story about my son. I'm not sure how many of you heard it, but he serves in a, can you hear me still? Okay, he serves, he lives in California, and he's a financial advisor and financial planner. And the majority of his clients are wealthy Republicans who followed Trump. But what he found, because his whole thing, he's a Baha'i, and his whole thing is to love the people that he is serving. And so he approaches them from a position of loving them first. And as a result, he makes sure to do everything he can for their money. But he forms a relationship with them. And are we not told in our faith that the first thing we're supposed to do is form relationships with each other? And in forming relationships, he's learning how lonely they are. And he's telling me this in generalities. He would never tell me about any individual person because that would be against the confidentiality of his work. But he says they're very lonely and they're very sad. And many of them are depressed, but they have all this money. And so loving them changes their hearts and they just want to spend time with him. So that's what I wanted to say. So opposing Obama-era policies has actually been harmful to white people in several different ways. It stifles innovation. And I think you've had time to read this, I hope. So I'm not going to read all of it, but the whole idea of whites needing to live in a whites-only society causes harm because the whole opportunity to take advantage of the diversity of a society is what allows for innovation to take place. It ruins our environment, and even though things are dumped in areas of people where the people are not considered to be full human beings, it may initially harm those people, Blacks and Indigenous, but eventually it harms everyone. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. So environmental injustice impacts every person on the planet, regardless of race. No one is, excuse me, I keep getting hoarse. No one is free until we are all free. Go on. This is a book that is written by a white man, and his name is Wendell Berry. He lives in Kentucky, and he calls the suffering that white people go through, that he went through and is going through, the hidden wound. He counsels that when you begin to awaken to the realities of what you know, you are subject to staggering recognitions of your complicity in history and in the events of your own life. Of this wound, this psychic and emotional damage that racism does to white people, he writes, I have borne it all my life, always with the most delicate consideration for the pain I would feel if I were somehow forced to acknowledge it. The crisis of racial awareness, the sense of being doomed by my history to be, if not always a racist, then a man always limited by the inheritance of racism, condemned to be always conscious of the necessity not to be a racist, to be always dealing deliberately with the reflexes of racism that are embedded in my mind as deeply as, at least, as the language I speak. Next. So this hidden wound can be considered an exercise in white anti-fragility. I mean, the work that he has done in writing this book, reading it and taking it in could be an exercise in white anti-fragility. Berry finds the stain of racism so stubborn that it would be foolish to think anyone can be exempt, individually or collectively. And then for the last third of his book, he explores the woundedness of modern American culture as a whole, the diseases of alienation and mechanization in economics, education, marriage, and agriculture, seeking especially to hear the voices of the poor who do not meet mainstream conceptions of respectability and success. Next. Ruha Benjamin, who is a Black author and someone who is a professor, PhD professor. Oh, okay. She wrote this book called Black Skin, White Mask, and this is one of many books that she has written. And in this book, she states, one of the things that's coming to light is how the global spread of a microscopic virus is placing the ravages of racism and inequity under the microscope. But the fact is, we don't all see the same thing. Racism has a way of actually distorting our vision. Intertwined with many other forms of social domination, racism is mercurial, innovative, even viral. And then she goes on to talk about anti-Blackness. And she says that anti-Blackness distorts reality, interpersonally and institutionally, exposing Black people to a threatening environment well before the pandemic, even in childhood. Next. I'm sure that some of you will have heard of Robin DiAngelo. She is a white person who has written a book called White Fragility. And in this book, she describes the disbelieving defensiveness that white people exhibit when their ideas about race and racism are challenged, and particularly when they feel implicated in white supremacy. Why, she wondered, did her feedback prompt such resistance, as if the mention of racism were more offensive than the fact or practice of it. To be perceived as an individual, to not be associated with anything negative because of your skin color, she notes, is a privilege largely afforded to white people, although most school shooters, domestic terrorists, and rapists in the United States are white. I'm trying to see how to do this so that it doesn't, oh, there we go. There we go. It is rare to see a white man on the street reduced to a stereotype. Likewise, people of color often endure having their views attributed to their racial identities. The luxury of impartiality is denied them. In DiAngelo's almost epidemiological vision of white racism, our minds and bodies play host to a pathogen that seeks to replicate itself, sickening us in the process. Like a mutating virus, racism shapeshifts in order to stay alive. When its explicit expression becomes taboo, it hides in coded language. Nor does prejudice disappear when people decide that they will no longer tolerate it. It just looks for ways to avoid detection. So let's go on. This is a quote that I think is also important to share, and it has to do with the whole idea of looking the other way. In order to prevent chronic discomfort, whites may learn not to notice, but in not noticing, one loses opportunities for greater insight into oneself and one's experience. A significant dimension of who one is in the world, one's whiteness, remains uninvestigated, and perceptions of daily experience are routinely distorted. Privilege goes unnoticed, and all but the most blatant acts of racial bigotry are ignored. Not noticing requires energy. Next. I'd like to play this video because I think it's a wonderful example of what happens to white liberals.
Okay, my white people, here's an important message from a black friend. As difficult and exhausting as this moment is, and it is, it's just going to get more challenging and more uncomfortable. But of all the battles you have to fight, the biggest one is white fatigue. Let me explain. White supremacy is the pernicious narrative that white people are superior to black folks and just about everyone else. White fatigue is what happens when most white people who don't want to think of themselves as white supremacists, and who might even fight that narrative, get tired, give up, and let white supremacy win. Alexander Hamilton is the poster child of white fatigue. He belonged to an anti-slavery society, but when we adopted the Constitution, he agreed to the Three-Fifths Compromise, white fatigue's original sin. Men like Hamilton felt they couldn't get a constitution without slavery, so they gave up trying and gave actual slave owners more power. After the Civil War, we put amendments in the Constitution to guarantee equal black citizenship. White supremacy formed a resistance, but it was white fatigue that lost the cause. We pulled Union troops from the South, and a Supreme Court full of Northerners paved the way to Jim Crow and streets full of Constellation trophies. White supremacy put them up, but white fatigue whistled past them every day for over a century. The Civil Rights Movement tried to stop white supremacy by shaking most white people out of white fatigue, disrupt normal, televised violence of white supremacists to jolt people sleepwalking through white fatigue. And for a minute, it worked. Hope and equality were adrenaline shots to the conscience of America. We got a second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. But Martin Luther King had to die to get that last one. And then we got white fatigue. Too tired to win the war on poverty, white fatigue let it become the war on crime, then the war on drugs. White fatigue mistook mass incarceration for justice. And then a pandemic hit. White eyes opened as black and brown bodies filled the front lines, and a host of hardly paid people were labeled essential. And then this. A knee to the neck of the facade of American equality, and an image taken by a courageous black girl just as the nation's eyes were already opening. And suddenly, white America is more awake to the distance between white life and black life than it has ever been. But right now, black America is losing sleep over white fatigue. It looms larger than any president, no matter how much of a white supremacist one proved himself to be. He might be defeated, but if the majority of white people get tired, or too busy, or distracted, or fooled into thinking we've actually won, this momentum will be killed by white fatigue. I'm telling you right now, it's gonna get more uncomfortable. It's going to be confusing and exhausting. You will want it to stop. But do not stop. New legislation isn't the end. This election isn't the end. There is no end because white supremacy will never quit, so black people cannot ever quit. You must battle white fatigue. Don't get tired. Don't ever give up. Do not wave the white flag.
So if we can go on, the next one has to do with what the Universal House of Justice says about racism in America. And it's very telling. It's a serious, serious indictment to what we are living under in America. And this comes from several different messages of the House of Justice. But it's the words that they use that I think is so impactful. When they call the racism in America as baneful, a cancerous affliction, a patent evil that it's transmuted into forms that are multifaceted, less blatant, and more intricate, and thus more intractable. They say that it's a pernicious blight on American society. They talk about the dire warnings that Abdu'l-Baha gave when he came. And then it moved on to a trenchant analysis, clear, unmistakable writings of Shoghi Effendi about it. It's a devastating ferocity. Countervailing processes, overt and covert. Countervailing means no matter what we do, and this was demonstrated in the video on white fatigue. No matter what we do, things are going to, there'll be ways in which white supremacy will find to go around it, go above it, under it, or right through it, until it gets us back to what it was before we passed legislation or before we tried to form relationships. And so the House of Justice is telling us that because of that, as Baha'is, we cannot rest. We cannot believe that we have already gotten there. They tell us that it's a long and thorny road beset with pitfalls that still lie ahead for us. And then what I mentioned earlier about it being a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. Go on. This is another video.
When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried its market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it.
This is just repeating what was said already about racism being a white problem. This is from Robin DiAngelo. Malcolm Gladwell, it requires that you change your life. Ijeoma Oluo, anti-racism is a commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. Go on. And then just a little bit of what Rahia Khanum said. She gave a talk, letter to America, and you can find that on the internet in 1961. And in that talk, she talked about how the majority of the peoples of the world are not white, and in the future, the majority of Baha'is will not be white also. But then she goes on and she says that even though the administrative order, the development of the faith in America was done by white people, we have to know that because of the condition of the society in which they grew up, that has infected them. It is only natural that their virtues and their faults should have colored the faith and its community life, and that it is illogical to suppose that what we have now is either mature or right. It is a phase. And so I just wanted to share that. Go on. There's a mounting, this is the House of Justice now. There's a mounting realization on the part of the world's people that the decades ahead are set to bring with them challenges among the most daunting that the human family has ever had to face. They talk about the global health crisis. They talked about the severity of whose cost would affect both lives and livelihoods. And they tell us that our efforts to succor and support one another in society will certainly need to be sustained and in places expanded. And then they tell us that the national, regional, and cluster levels will require communities of proven strength to help them. And that in this year, meaning this year that ends in April, every community must draw on whatever untapped potential it may possess and seek to overcome any obstacles that are in the way of our doing what we need to be doing to effect a difference. Go on. In the July 22nd letter that was so impactful by many, many of us, within the context of the framework governing your activities, it is necessary to carefully examine the forces unfolding around you, to determine where your energies might reinforce the most promising initiatives, what you should avoid, and how you might lend a distinctive contribution. It is not possible for you to effect the transformation envisioned by Baha'u'llah merely by adopting the perspectives, practices, concepts, criticisms, and language of contemporary society. Our approach should instead be distinguished by maintaining a humble posture of learning, weighing alternatives, consulting to harmonize differing views, and marching forward with unbreakable unity. Go on. So the last thing that I'm leaving everyone with is this quote. And this quote is for all of us, but specifically for our white brothers and sisters, because they are the ones that are most tightly held in a bud. And it's the bud of living as a member of the oppressors of society. And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. That's it as far as the PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to go further with the rest of this. I do want to say that there are avenues that are taking place to help with this process. One main one, it's called Copper to Gold, and it's an organization that has been created by white people, Baha'is, who are helping white people to recognize the unconscious and sometimes conscious things that are said and done that are harmful to Blacks and people of color and indigenous people that they may not realize are harmful. And it started out with just I think it was like 6 weeks, one session, and it has progressed to now they are in the middle of a 15-week sessions, and there are 3 of them, and at each one there are like 20 people, and they have a waiting list for the next session that's going to happen in the spring. I apologize for the hoarseness that I'm developing. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is because anyone who is interested in going through that, it's transformative. Because each week they deal with just one of the things that are done by white people that can be harmful to Blacks and people of color, so that they see it, they consult about it. It's a safe space for them to engage with the discomfort of having to deal with it and how to move forward from that discomfort to a place of transformation. So with that, I would like to end the presentation, such as it was with everything that happened. And I understand that you want to open it up for comments and questions.
Thank you so much, dear Sue, for this insightful and researched presentation on the effect of racism on white people. It was really a phenomenal presentation, as well as your grace with all of the technological challenges that we were presented with. Friends, at this time, if you are able to do so, do come on screen, come on video, click on the video camera icon in the lower left of your screen so we can have a community conversation about this challenging issue. If you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, please raise your hand. Actually, we're going to stop the video so that people have a safe space in order to share their thoughts